Elijah lo que quieras, dijo haste que sus hijas pidieran, queremos que esa mujer Apache sea nuestra mamá. Carlos Navarro had always been a man of the land. His life, rooted deep in the Arizona soil, had been shaped by the steady rhythms of ranching. He was a man who lived by the seasons, whose days were guided by the rise and fall of the sun. His ranch was everything, its rugged, dry landscape, its wide-open fields, and its animals. For Carlos, there was no life more fulfilling than the one he had made. Yet, even in the quiet beauty of his ranch, something had always been missing. His wife, Alina, had been his rock, the heart of the family. Together, they had raised 2 daughters, Luz and Sophia. But when Alina passed away from an unexpected illness 3 years ago, something inside Carlos changed. He could no longer find peace in the familiar comforts of his life. The absence of his wife created a hollow ache in his heart that no amount of work or solitude could fill. Carlos did his best to raise his daughters alone, but it wasn't easy. Luz, the older of the 2, had inherited her mother's caring nature. She often took on the role of a second mother to Sophia, making sure her little sister was always safe, fed, and happy. Sophia, on the other hand, was more like Carlos, a dreamer, lost in her own thoughts, always curious about the world around her. Both girls were the light of his life, but he knew he couldn't replace Alina for them. No one could. He struggled with being both a father and a mother to them, and despite his love for them, he often felt overwhelmed. For months, Carlos had been quietly grappling with his loneliness. His life had become a routine: work the land, tend to the cattle, fix fences, and then repeat. He found comfort in his work, but the loneliness still lingered. At times, he would catch himself looking out at the distant mountains, thinking of Alina and wondering what could have been. He missed the conversations they used to have in the quiet evenings, sharing dreams and worries. Now, there was no one to share that with. It was during this time, when he felt most vulnerable, that he met Nayeli. It was a day like any other when Carlos first encountered her. He had been struggling with an injured horse, one of his prized animals that had slipped in the mud and twisted its leg. He had tried to tend to it himself, but the injury seemed worse than he had initially thought. His ranch hands had suggested calling a vet from the nearby town, but Carlos knew that the horse needed something beyond medical treatment. It needed someone who understood the land and the animals. And that's how he ended up in the small shop at the edge of town, a place he had never thought to visit before. The sign above the door read Nayeli's Healing Hands, and beneath it, there was a small symbol of an eagle soaring high in the sky, a symbol that seemed strangely fitting for someone who worked with animals and the earth. When Carlos entered, he was greeted by a soft voice. "En que te puedo ayudar?" the voice asked. It was calm, with a slight accent, but warm and inviting. Looking up, Carlos saw a woman standing at the counter. She was tall and slender, with dark hair braided into a single thick plait down her back. Her skin was a deep tan and her eyes were dark like the night sky, yet there was a peacefulness about her, a quiet strength that made Carlos feel at ease for the first time in a long while. "I've got a horse, a bad injury. I've tried everything I know, but I think he needs something else," Carlos said, his voice low, almost embarrassed. He wasn't the type to ask for help easily, but something in her presence made him feel like he could. She studied him for a moment as though seeing into him before nodding. "I can help," she said simply. "Follow me." Carlos watched, amazed at how this woman, a stranger to him, seemed to have such an effortless connection with the animal. Nayeli wasn't a veterinarian, but rather a healer, a woman who had learned from the land, from her Apache ancestors, the ways of natural medicine and care. She wasn't from the town itself, but from a nearby reservation where she had been raised with a deep respect for the earth and its creatures. Carlos was struck by the gentleness in her eyes, a gentleness that made her seem both strong and kind at once. After the horse was treated, Carlos stood beside her, uncertain of what to say. I don't know what to say," he muttered, still in awe of her skill. "You don't have to say anything," she replied. "The earth speaks for itself, we just listen." He felt an unspoken connection, as though fate had brought him here for a reason. As she gathered her things to leave, she turned to him and smiled. "Your horse will be fine, but you should take better care of him. The land has its way of healing, but we must respect it," she said softly. With that, she walked away, leaving Carlos standing in the fading light of the afternoon, feeling something stir within him, a curiosity, an interest, maybe even a hope that he hadn't felt in a long time. The days after their meeting passed slowly, but Carlos couldn't stop thinking about Nayeli. Her words lingered in his mind, her presence stayed with him long after she had left. He found himself visiting the town more often, on small errands or business he had neglected before. Sometimes he would catch a glimpse of her at the market, talking to the locals with a quiet, dignified grace that he found both strange and comforting. But he didn't speak to her again. Not at first. Something held him back. Maybe it was his fear of change, his unwillingness to let anyone new into his life, especially after the loss of Alina. Or perhaps, deep down, he knew that there was something between them, something unspoken, that could make his life complicated in ways he wasn't sure he was ready for. It wasn't until one cool evening when he was walking out of the small local diner that their paths crossed again. This time, Nayeli was sitting outside, a basket of herbs beside her, as though she had been waiting. She greeted him with a warm smile, and without missing a beat she asked, "How is the horse?" "Thanks to you." There was no judgment in her eyes, only understanding. It was in that moment that Carlos realized something he hadn't fully acknowledged before. He was beginning to like her, not just as someone who had helped him with his horse, but as someone who made him feel less alone in the world. But there was still a question lingering in his mind. What would his daughters think of her? Little did he know, that question would soon become far more pressing than he could have ever imagined. Carlos's days grew quieter after that chance encounter with Nayeli. The weight of his duties on the ranch remained ever present, but there was something different about him now. A new sense of awareness lingered in his thoughts. Every time he thought of the quiet woman with the dark, knowing eyes, he felt a spark of something. It wasn't a loud, burning emotion. It was subtle, like the soft warmth of a fire on a cold night. Yet, despite these new feelings, Carlos couldn't shake the nagging responsibility he felt toward his daughters, Luz and Sophia. He had been a father to them for years now, trying his best to guide them through life's ups and downs without the help of his late wife, Alina. But as much as he wanted to hold on to the old ways, things were changing. His daughters had grown, and with their growth came new challenges, new questions. Luz, now 13, was more than just his daughter. She had become his helper, his right hand in many ways. With her long, brown hair and bright, eager eyes, she often took charge when it came to the day-to-day chores on the ranch. She had a natural ability to read the land, to understand what needed to be done without even being asked. Carlos was proud of her, but sometimes he felt a pang of guilt. Luz had taken on so many responsibilities, things a child shouldn't have to worry about, simply because Carlos hadn't known how to manage everything by himself. Sophia, the younger of the two, was quieter. At 11, she was full of dreams and questions. She loved wandering through the fields, picking wildflowers, and imagining stories about the world outside their ranch. Sophia reminded Carlos so much of Alina, her soft voice, her gentle nature, and the way she could brighten any room with just her presence. Yet, Sophia's quietness also worried him. She wasn't as independent as Luz. Sophia often needed reassurance, and Carlos wondered if his absence at times was leaving a void in her life. It was one evening, while they were all sitting around the dinner table, that Luz brought up something Carlos had been avoiding. "Papa," Luz said, glancing up from her plate, "how come you don't talk about Nayeli anymore?" He had hoped that his growing interest in Nayeli would go unnoticed by the girls, but Luz, as always, seemed to sense everything. He cleared his throat and placed his fork down slowly. "What do you mean?" he asked, keeping his voice even. "You know, the woman you met at the healer's shop," Luz said, looking at him with those knowing eyes that always seemed to see more than he wanted her to. "We liked her. You seem to like her too." His daughters had noticed things he hadn't even realized he was giving away. "She's a good woman," Carlos said after a pause, choosing his words carefully. "But she's just a friend for now. You don't need to worry about that." Maybe she could be more than just a friend. It had been years since Elena passed, and he had never allowed himself to think about the possibility of a new relationship. "I don't know, Luz," he replied softly. "I think it's more complicated than you understand." Sophia had always been sensitive to his moods, and it was clear that she had noticed his sadness, even when he tried to hide it. "I'm not sad, Sophia," he said, trying to reassure her. I'm just thinking about things, that's all." He loved his daughters more than anything in the world, and their happiness meant everything to him. But the idea of bringing someone new into their lives felt terrifying. What if it didn't work out? What if Nayeli wasn't the right person for them? Or worse, what if it hurt the girls? That night, Carlos lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The conversation with Luz and Sophia kept playing over and over in his mind. His daughters were right. He had been so focused on the past, so afraid of moving on, that he hadn't allowed himself to think about the future. And the future was something he had to start thinking about, for his sake and for theirs. In the days that followed, Carlos found himself thinking more and more about Nayeli. He remembered her calm presence, the way she had handled the injured horse with such tenderness and care. He thought about the way she had listened to him when he opened up to her that first time, how easy it had felt to talk to her. He couldn't deny that there was something special about her. But the next time he saw her, he wasn't sure what to say. Should he ask her to dinner? Should he even tell her how he felt, or was that rushing things too quickly? He wasn't sure how someone like Nayeli would even feel about him. He was just a rancher, an older man with 2 young daughters and a lot of baggage. Nayeli had her own life, her own world, one that didn't revolve around him or his ranch. It was during a trip to town one afternoon that Carlos saw her again. Nayeli was at the local market, talking to a few of the townspeople, her basket full of herbs and other remedies. She was laughing at something one of the women had said, her face glowing with that same quiet light that drew him in. For a moment, Carlos hesitated, unsure of whether or not to approach her. But before he could decide, Nayeli turned and saw him standing there. "Carlos," she said with a smile, "it's good to see you." Nayeli raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Oh, and what about?" "The land always gives us what we need, if we're willing to listen." He wanted to say more, to ask her about her life, to see if she might want to spend more time together, but the words didn't come. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Nayeli spoke again. "You know, I'm having a small gathering at my place tomorrow, just a few people. You and the girls are welcome to join if you'd like." He hadn't expected her to be so open, so willing to bring him and his daughters into her life. "We'd be happy to come," Carlos said before he could think twice about it. As he left the market, he couldn't help but smile to himself. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new, a step forward for him and for his daughters. The days leading up to the small gathering at Nayeli's place were filled with a quiet anticipation that Carlos hadn't expected. The invitation had been a surprise, simple, but full of promise. It was strange, this feeling of something new on the horizon, something he hadn't allowed himself to consider in a long time. Yet, as the evening drew closer, Carlos found himself looking forward to it more than he thought he would. He had told Luz and Sophia about the gathering, and both of them were excited, though for different reasons. Luz, ever the practical one, was curious about Nayeli's life and her customs. She had always been interested in the stories of the Native American culture, its deep connection to the land, its respect for nature, and the wisdom passed down through generations. Sophia, on the other hand, was simply eager to meet new people. She had always been the more outgoing of the two, and her curiosity about the world was endless. She asked Carlos 100 questions about Nayeli, mostly about her family, her traditions, and how she knew so much about healing. Carlos had told them little about his own feelings toward Nayeli. He didn't want to overwhelm them. He still wasn't sure how to put his thoughts into words. The truth was, he was both excited and nervous. He wanted his daughters to like Nayeli. More than that, he wanted to see if they could find a place in their lives for her. But he also didn't want to push them too hard. He needed to take it slow, for everyone's sake. The evening of the gathering arrived, and the air was cool, the sky painted with shades of purple and orange as the sun began to set. Carlos made sure the girls were dressed in their best clothes, though they didn't have much, just simple, worn-out dresses that Alina had sewn for them. They weren't fancy, but they would do. He wanted to make a good impression on Nayeli, even though he didn't know exactly what that meant. When they arrived at Nayeli's home, Carlos was struck by the way it blended so naturally with the land. Her small house was tucked into a quiet part of the forest, nestled between tall pines and rugged cliffs. It was a modest place, with wooden walls that seemed to merge with the earth, and a wide porch where a few people were already gathered. The scent of cooking food drifted through the air, mixing with the fresh, earthy smell of pine. Nayeli greeted them warmly at the door. She looked even more beautiful in the soft evening light, her long hair pulled back into a braid, her eyes glowing with kindness. She wore a simple dress, but there was something about the way she carried herself that made her seem both graceful and grounded. "Carlos," she said, her voice warm and inviting. "I'm so glad you could make it. Come in, come in. There's plenty of food, and some people you'll want to meet." It was warm and welcoming with handmade decorations, dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, and a small fire burning in the hearth. The walls were lined with shelves of books, many of them old, their pages yellowed with age. Luz and Sophia were already looking around with wide eyes, taking everything in. Sophia, of course, was the first to speak. "This place smells amazing," she said, her voice full of wonder. "What's that smell?" Nayeli motioned for them to follow her into the small kitchen area, where a large pot of stew simmered on the stove. Carlos noticed that the kitchen, though small, was well organized and filled with fresh ingredients. "Why don't you sit down for a bit?" Nayeli suggested, pulling out 3 chairs for them. "It's just a small gathering, nothing too formal. You'll meet a few of my friends, and we can talk about the land, about nature, and all the good things that life has to offer." But he couldn't deny the warmth he felt in Nayeli's presence. It was a kind of calmness that made everything feel just a little bit easier. As the evening went on, more people arrived, some familiar faces from the town, others from nearby reservations. Carlos was surprised to find that everyone seemed so open, so welcoming. There was no rush, no pressure. Just good conversation, hearty laughter, and a deep sense of connection to the land. The guests shared stories about their families, their childhoods, and the ancient ways of their ancestors. The conversation flowed easily, and Carlos found himself slowly relaxing. Sophia and Luz had already made friends with a couple of the younger children, who were about the same age as them. They laughed and played in the corner, their voices bright and carefree. Carlos watched them, feeling a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something good. At one point during the evening, Nayeli invited everyone to sit around the fire outside. The air had turned cooler, and the flames crackled warmly as the group gathered around. Carlos found a spot next to Nayeli, feeling both comfortable and nervous at the same time. The firelight danced on her face, casting shadows that made her seem even more enchanting. "This is where I like to spend most of my time," Nayeli said quietly, her gaze fixed on the fire. "It's where I can think, reflect, and listen to the land. I've learned so much from nature, how to heal, how to live with the earth instead of against it." It was almost as if she viewed nature as a partner, a teacher, not something to be tamed. "I've heard some of the stories about your family, Nayeli," Carlos said, his voice softer than usual. "Your people have such a deep connection to the land." The earth provides for us, but we must give back as well. The warmth from the fire, the easy laughter of the group, and the sense of belonging all seemed to wash over him. This was the first time in a long while that he had felt like he could simply be himself, without the weight of responsibility or the shadow of his past. Eventually, the gathering began to wind down. The children yawned, and the adults started to say their goodbyes. Carlos and Nayeli stood together near the door, watching as the last of the guests left. "I'm glad you came," Nayeli said softly, her voice gentle in the night air. "It was good to have you here. I didn't know what to expect, but this was exactly what I needed." Carlos had never been one to rely on others, especially not since Elena's passing. But Nayeli's offer wasn't about dependency. It was about trust, about opening his heart again to the possibility of sharing his burdens with someone who understood. "I don't know what the future holds," Carlos said, his voice sincere. "But I'm willing to find out. I think I'm ready to let go of some of the fear." It had shown him that there was still hope, still room for new beginnings, even for someone like him, someone who had buried himself in the past for so long. And as he drove back home with Luz and Sophia, he couldn't help but wonder if this was the start of something even greater. The weeks following the gathering at Nayeli's house were a whirlwind of change for Carlos and his daughters. Life on the ranch carried on as it always had, work in the fields, tending to the cattle, fixing fences. But there was a noticeable shift. Carlos found himself thinking more and more about the evening with Nayeli, about her calm presence, her quiet wisdom. And as much as he tried to focus on the daily tasks at hand, he couldn't ignore the growing feeling inside him that something new was on the horizon. Nayeli, too, seemed to be becoming more and more a part of his life, though in ways that were still hard to put into words. They began seeing each other more often, each meeting casual, like two old friends reconnecting after a long time. There were visits to the ranch, where Nayeli would help with the animals, or sometimes she'd bring over fresh herbs she'd gathered from the woods. Carlos found himself looking forward to those visits, though he tried not to admit it even to himself. She made everything feel a little more manageable, as though the weight of the world wasn't so heavy when she was around. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip low in the sky, casting the land in a warm, golden light, Carlos found himself on the porch, lost in thought. The ranch had been unusually quiet that day. Luz and Sophia had gone to visit a friend in town, leaving Carlos alone with his thoughts. He couldn't help but think about Nayeli and how much she had come to mean to him. His feelings for her were no longer something he could ignore. He had spent so long building walls around his heart, afraid of losing again, afraid of what might happen if he let someone else in. But with Nayeli, those walls didn't seem so necessary anymore. It was then that the first sign of trouble came. A fire had started on the far side of the ranch. It was small at first, just a wisp of smoke in the distance, but within moments it spread faster than Carlos could have anticipated. The wind was picking up, and the dry grass in the fields ignited like kindling. Panic rose in Carlos's chest as he realized the fire could easily jump to the barn and the stables, where the horses and cattle were kept. Without thinking, he grabbed his jacket and raced for the tractor, desperate to get to the fire before it grew out of control. He called for Luz and Sophia, but they weren't home. His heart pounded as he made his way toward the source of the fire, hoping against hope that he could control it before it reached the animals. The sound of the flames roaring in the distance was deafening. As he neared the fire, Carlos realized that he wouldn't be able to fight it on his own. The wind was too strong, the fire spreading too quickly. He needed help fast. That's when he remembered Nayeli. Without thinking twice, Carlos grabbed his phone and called her, his hands shaking. "Nayeli, there's a fire on the ranch," he said urgently, his voice tight with panic. "I need help right now." He reached the edge of the fire just as the first streaks of smoke began to darken the sky. His heart raced as he frantically tried to dig a fire break, hoping it would slow the spread of the flames. But the fire was too fast, the heat too intense. Every step he took felt like a battle against the inevitable. Then, just as he was about to lose hope, he saw Nayeli. She appeared as though from nowhere, moving with a purpose that left Carlos in awe. She wasn't running but walking with a steady pace, carrying a bundle of wet blankets and tools. Her eyes were focused, her expression calm, and for a moment Carlos felt a surge of relief flood through him. "I told you I'd be here," Nayeli said, her voice calm and assured. "We're going to stop this fire." As the fire continued to spread, Nayeli stayed calm, her focus unshaken by the growing danger. Carlos, who had never been one to rely on others, found himself following her lead. She knew exactly what to do, and in her presence, the panic that had gripped him seemed to fade away. The minutes stretched into hours as they worked together, fighting the fire side by side. And though Carlos could feel the exhaustion in his bones, there was something about being with Nayeli, something about her steady, unshakable calm, that gave him the strength to keep going. As the sun set, casting a blood-red glow over the sky, Carlos felt the first flicker of hope. The fire was beginning to die down. The worst of it had passed, and though the land had been scorched, the animals were safe and the ranch had been spared. Nayeli stood beside him, her face covered in soot, her clothes damp from the sweat and the effort. She smiled at him, and in that moment Carlos realized something. He had never felt more alive, more grateful than he did in that moment, standing next to her. "You did it," Carlos said, his voice rough with emotion. "We did it." Hope that things could change, that his life could become something different, something better. "You saved everything," Carlos said, his voice thick with gratitude. Nayeli shook her head. "The land saved itself," she said softly. "We just helped it along. The earth knows how to heal, we just need to trust it." He had heard these words before, but hearing them from Nayeli in this moment made them feel real, made them feel possible. For the first time, Carlos allowed himself to believe that maybe there was something beyond the pain of the past, something worth fighting for. The fire was nearly out, the sky darkening with the arrival of night. Carlos stood there, watching the last embers fade away, and for the first time in a long while he felt a sense of peace. He was no longer alone. He had Nayeli, and in that moment he realized that whatever the future held, it would be something they could face together. The days after the fire passed in a blur. The once scorched fields were beginning to show signs of new life, as the land, always resilient, slowly healed itself. The animals had been safe, the barns untouched, and the ranch had survived what could have been a devastating loss. The fire had come and gone, but it had left behind something more than just blackened earth. It had left a sense of change in the air. Carlos had always been a man of few words, but the events of the past few weeks had opened something inside him that he wasn't sure how to close again. He couldn't deny it anymore. He had fallen for Nayeli. There was no denying the pull he felt when she was around, or the quiet sense of peace that settled in his heart whenever she smiled at him. But it wasn't just that. It was the way she made him see things differently. The way she showed him that life wasn't just about survival, but about living with a sense of purpose, with a respect for the land and the people around you. Nayeli had become a constant presence in their lives, in a way that felt both natural and comforting. She was no longer just someone who helped with the ranch. She was a part of their world, a part of their family. And though Carlos had been hesitant at first, unsure of what this all meant, he knew now that this was what he needed, this feeling of connection, of being part of something bigger than himself. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky and the warm breeze rustled through the trees, Carlos stood by the edge of the pasture, watching the girls play. Luz was teaching Sophia how to saddle a horse, her voice full of authority, while Sophia listened intently, trying her best to follow her older sister's instructions. They made a good team, Luz with her practicality and confidence and Sophia with her quiet curiosity and determination. Carlos smiled to himself, feeling a swell of pride in his chest. His daughters had grown so much over the years, and they were becoming young women who could take on the world in their own ways. But the change wasn't just in the girls. It was in him, too. He looked across the pasture, his eyes searching for the familiar figure he had come to look for at the end of each day. Nayeli was there, standing near the fence, watching the girls with a contented smile on her face. Her presence had become so much a part of his life that he couldn't imagine a day without it. She had come to mean more to him than he had ever expected, and though they had not yet spoken of it, he knew in his heart that they were on the same page, that something was growing between them, something strong and real. Carlos walked toward her, his steps slow but purposeful. When he reached her side, Nayeli turned to him, her smile lighting up her face. "I think they've got it," Nayeli said, nodding toward the girls. "Luz is a good teacher. She's got the patience of a saint." He had learned that part of healing was remembering the past, honoring it but not letting it control him. Nayeli nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. "You don't have to forget her, Carlos. Elena will always be a part of you. She gave you the strength to get this far." He had always carried the memory of Elena with him, but it had been a burden, a heavy weight that he wasn't sure how to carry anymore. Nayeli was right, though. He didn't have to forget. He just had to learn to live alongside those memories, to honor them without letting them hold him back. "I know," he said quietly, "but I think I'm ready to start living again, really living. With the girls, with you." Her eyes were full of warmth, but there was something else in them, too, a quiet, unspoken promise that made his heart race. He had come so far, and so had she. They had both been through their own struggles, their own pains, but they had found a way to come together in the most unexpected way. "You've changed everything for me," Carlos said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I never thought I'd find someone like you. You've shown me so much about life, about the land, about the girls, and about myself." This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment where he no longer had to carry the burden of his past alone. He had Nayeli and he had his daughters. Together, they were strong. Together, they could face whatever came their way. The sound of the girls laughing interrupted his thoughts, and Carlos turned to see Luz and Sophia walking toward them, their faces bright with excitement. "We did it, Papa," Luz said, her voice full of pride. "We've got the saddle on perfectly. Sophia's a natural." Finally she spoke, her voice quiet but full of sincerity. "Papa," she said, "I'm glad you found her. I can see how happy she makes you." He looked at Nayeli, whose face softened at Luz's words, and for the first time Carlos felt a sense of certainty in his heart. "I'm glad too, Luz," he said quietly. "I'm very glad." "Does this mean we'll have a bigger family now?" "I think we'll have the family we've always needed," Carlos said softly. "A family that grows together, a family that helps each other." For the first time in years, Carlos felt like he was exactly where he needed to be, with the people who mattered most. He had come a long way from the man he had been, and though the road ahead would still have its challenges, he knew he wasn't walking it alone. And with Nayeli by his side, with Luz and Sophia's laughter filling the air, Carlos finally felt like he was home.